This chapter of Time of Contempt and this episode of the podcast contain discussions of war and suicide. Listener discretion is advised.
My first ever podcast episode.
How did you like it?
Yeah, I liked it very much. I actually talked with my friends that I will be on your podcast, and they were like, can you send us the link later? And so I was like, okay, that is really nice, but also everything that I will tell here, they will hear. So, and they are also historians. So yeah, but that is also so interesting. Like in Czech, when we say that someone studies something, we refer to them as for example, as historians or doctors, even though they don't have that title or degree. And I actually have that degree. And when you first said that, you two are historians, I thought about it and I said, oh, wait, I actually am a historian. I actually am an expert.
I love that for you. That's so exciting. Yeah, and congratulations.
Yeah, for me too as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's always interesting because people on the expert thing, it's funny because often when you tell people like, oh, you study history or something, they like think you know like everything, of course,
Sure.
Which is not true, of course, but I think even in your field of expertise, you just like you don't know every little detail that happened. But I think what I appreciate most about studying history is, and I think what it teaches you most is maybe not to know everything, but know where or how to find everything. Because I think research is one of the, if not the most important aspect of being a historian. It's like, okay, I don't know everything, but I know how to find it out. So that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
History is such a large topic that like all of my classmates have different paths that they took in history. There are, for example, my female colleagues, which some do gender history, others do, for example, the history of nobility, others do the military history, others do political history. And so it's fascinating how broad the subject of history is.
Let's talk about everything across all time forever. Like that's
yeah.
It's no wonder it's so broad. Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. It is so nice to be home. I hope you all had a lovely and safe Halloween weekend. Thank you to everyone who made Vienna and our hanza meetup so special last weekend. It was so nice to see everybody, as it always is, right? And I'm so excited to share all of the things that we did there, from our hiking to our little mystery box museum tour, and all the schnitzel that we had, all the fun Austrian pancakes we had with you all on the Breakfast in Beauclair social media channels. So keep a lookout for those recaps coming up. Thanks as always to our podcast patrons over on Patreon and our produce-level patrons, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B, Heaven of the Edge of the World, Charlotte from Mecklenburg Glamorai, The Original Roach, Conrad's Cat, Libby, John of Riblia, Tom from Australia, Jill, Kate the Tabby Witch, James Carson III, Miriam of Temeria, and Softy. As for this episode, Cyprian from Berlin and Štěpán from the Czech Republic call in for Andrzej Sapkowski's Time of Contempt, Chapter 5. Join us as we discuss new insights into the Czech translation of The Witcher, parallels between the Celtic and Nilfgaardian War and our modern military history, Geralt's evolving perspective on neutrality, vignettes from the front, and someone throws down the gauntlet over the second best Witcher game. Without further ado, let's get into our discussion of Time of Contempt, Chapter 5. Hey guys, welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name is Alyssa, and today we're welcoming two members of our Hanza to the show. My first guest is a historian from Berlin who you'll recognize from his appearances on episodes 3, 4, and 16 of the podcast, covering the short stories A Question of Price and The Lesser Evil, and Netflix's The Witcher 101, The End's Beginning. My second guest lives in Prague, the Czech Republic, and currently studies history at Charles University, where he recently earned his bachelor's degree. Please welcome Cyprian from Berlin and Štěpán from the Czech Republic. Hey guys, how are you doing?
Hey, Alyssa. Well, we're doing great, I hope. I mean, look at Stefan's face. It tells everything. Yeah, we're excited. I mean, I'm glad to be back. It's been a while, but yeah, I always like talking about books, as you know, and yeah, I'm glad to be back and also meet Stefan.
Yeah, hello. I'm also very excited to be on the podcast. And as you said, I earned my degree a few days back. So it's been a marathon of celebration since then. So my mood currently is great.
Amazing. Well, I'm excited to celebrate with you and chit-chat everything about The Witcher. As I ask every guest, Štěpán, how is it that you got into The Witcher?
Okay, so my journey with The Witcher began when I was 7 years old, because my brother bought the Witcher 1 game, and I watched him while he played it. I didn't understand everything that was going on because I was a small child and he was killing monsters and sleeping with women and stuff like that. So that was my first introduction. And later my brother bought the Witcher books, the first 5 books. He told me that they are really good, but I'm too young to read them. I should wait a little bit, so I waited. Then I read them, and I thought that they were absolutely fantastic. And so I actually bought the Lady of the Lake and the Tower of the Swallow to our collection. And yeah, since that I was a great Witcher fan. I actually am one of those people that played The Witcher in order, because I played The Witcher 1, then The Witcher 2, and then The Witcher 3. So yeah, I think my journey with The Witcher is typical of probably many people that were on the podcast, but it's rather typical of the typical Czech fan.
Yeah.
Because the Witcher brand here is really huge.
Oh, that's so interesting. Cyprian, what have you been up to since your last appearance on the podcast? Maybe 4 years ago?
It's been a while.
It's been a hot second.
We get back to that, but I just have one quick question for Štěpán. This is something I've been also defending in the Discord a lot. Which one is your second favorite Witcher game? Because Witcher 3, of course, I assume is the best one, but which one is the second best?
Witcher 1, Gary can suck it.
Wow, okay.
Garrison, you're called out.
so shots fired, I see.
Yeah.
What about you, Cyprian?
Well, I'm dying on that hill that Witcher 1 is better than Witcher 2. Yeah, I know it's a hot take, but I stand by it, and everyone is welcome to argue in the Discord. But yeah, what have I been up to? I mean, a lot. I think we had a pandemic in the meantime, so that was interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've finishing my degree in history in Berlin. I've been moving as well. Family members got married. I found a partner. So life was happening, right? But it was good. It was great. Again, as Alyssa, you already mentioned, my hair is still growing. So yeah.
Good for you, Cyprian.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, just normal life stuff, I guess. But we're going in a good direction. Everything is fine. I haven't been to the US yet, so we'll see how that goes. I mean, you have been visiting Europe quite a few times already, so maybe we can
often. Yeah.
Maybe we can. Some of us can hop over in the other direction, but we'll see. Yeah. And again, glad to be back.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. You were such a staple in the early episodes, and, we're circling back around 60 episodes later, and I'm really excited to have you back as well. I'm thrilled to be introducing you to. For listeners, Cyprian and I have had a long relationship over the last 4 or 5 years, and I got to visit him as well as Lars from Witcherflix in Berlin in January 2020. Štěpán I've gotten to know through the Hanza Discord over the last, 2-3 years. And both historians, And when I was putting together the guest list for this season, I was like, oh my God, I have to have these two meet. It'll be so exciting. And I think this is going to be one of those episodes where I sit here and say nothing. And I'm really, really excited to see what you guys are able to discuss in such military and history-heavy chapter. We hear a lot about movements on the continent and the beginning of the war. Today, we'll continue our discussion of Andrzej Sapkowski's Time of Contempt with Chapter 5, in which Dandelion reunites with Geralt and Beauclair following the Thanid coup. Dandelion brings news to the gravely injured Witcher about the fall of Illyria and Aedirn, the unexpected Nilfgaardian alliances, the dissolvement of the Council of Mages, and whispers that Ciri has already been brought to Nilfgaard. Here's a quick synopsis of the chapter from future Alyssa. In Chapter 5, Dandelion journeys alone across the ribbon into Beauclair in search of the Witcher, who is healing amongst the Dryads after injuries sustained at Thanid. There, the bard tells Geralt about the recent events that have shaken the continent. Nilfgaard attacked Illyria and Aedirn without declaring war because of Demavend of Aedern's attack in Dol Angra during the Mages' Conclave on Thanid. Vengerberg and 6,000 of its residents fell to Nilfgaard with refugees fleeing to Temeria and Redania, including Rayla, the Aedirnian captain we met in Chapter 2. Redania is in disarray after Visimir's assassination, leaving it unable to help its allies in the north. After assessing the situation, King Foltest of Temeria strikes a deal with Nilfgaard. Temeria and Cadwyn do nothing to stop the Nilfgaardian invasion. Upon hearing how the kingdom stood idly by, Geralt voices his contempt for neutrality. Francesca Findabair has aligned the elves with Emir and Nilfgaard in exchange for Dol Blythana. In return, the Scoia'tael commandos must continue to fight and disrupt the northern kingdoms. She may not interfere. Following her own involvement in the destruction of the Brotherhood, Tissaia de Vries takes her own life. Vilgefortz, Yennefer, and Ciri's whereabouts are unknown. In Nilfgaard, Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon is introduced to Emir Var Emrys and the court of Lochgrim Palace. There, we learn from Emir himself that this is not the real Ciri, but an impostor sent to trick him. Angered, the Emperor gives orders to Vadier de Rideau for Rince and Cahir's arrest, and sends Stefan Skellen, also known as Tawny Owl, to capture Ciri and Vilgefortz. The chapter ends with the Nilfgaardian Emperor proclaiming, "I will know the real Ciri. I would know her at the end of the world and in the darkness of hell." Now that we've gotten a quick synopsis of the chapter, I would love to get into it with both of you. What were some of your overall thoughts?
Right. I mean, I think this is a very important chapter as well, because it's like a recap through Dandelion, like telling Geralt what was basically happening while he was away in Brooklyn, and it still is, right? We get like a retelling of how the war is going, because this is something Geralt is especially interested in, how the political situation is developing in various places, right? In Nilfgaard, in Temeria. Yeah, so I think it's also like a breath of fresh air, because we get like these glimpses into these situations as well, right? Like Dandelion's telling something, and then it switches, like, for example, to the commander, and they're like retelling it from his perspective as well. So I really like it, and I think it's good for the pacing of the book as well.
When I read it again for this recording, I was surprised by just how much information and how many point of views are presented in this chapter, and how often Sapkowski jumps from POV to POV, and it is quite astonishing how he is dealing with the war, but also with the relationship between Dandelion and Geralt, and with the situation between Emir and the court. Yeah, I thought that it was one of the, I think, heaviest chapters in the book in this regard.
It's certainly the longest. I listened to the audiobook, and Peter Kenny does such a fantastic job of like capturing the moods and the atmospheres of all of these different scenes, and of course the urgency and the hesitancy with which Geralt wants to know more information, and Dandelion is trying to, like, obviously he's in an unsafe space, he's in Brokilon, he doesn't feel ready, he feels very guilty for what he has or hasn't told Geralt, and it's so beautifully acted in the audiobooks. But this is an exposition dump, which is it's challenging to do, and I think it's challenging to get right when you're reading any series or fantasy in general. And, you know, credit to Sapkowski, it's not boring. Like, between the conversation that Geralt and Dandelion have, as well as all of the little vignettes that humanize the military movement around the continent, it's entertaining, I think, beyond anything else. Like, and it's very compelling to not just hear that, you know, there were refugees fleeing, for example, but we're with Rayla. We have the urgency and the desperation that those mercenaries are fighting against the Scoia'tael, and the realization that they're all going to die. And that's just one example. We also hear about, you know, Tissa's suicide. Did any of the mages turn after Belgafort's? And we get the entire vignette of Tissa coming to terms and, like, her resolution to either write or to give up. And it's startling, I think, and impactful when you're reading and humanizing these situations that, when you're hearing about it, like particularly from Dandelion to Geralt, can probably feel very clinical. And I think that these vignettes do a fantastic job of carrying us through the chapter and humanizing the effects of war.
Yeah.
Any particular highlights and lowlights for you as you guys were reading? When I was listening to the audiobook, Peter Kenny sings all of the little songs that Dandelion sings to the Dryads, so I really liked that. And to say a suicide scene is one of those scenes, even when I first read the series, that was so impactful and very memorable. Anything else stand out to you guys in this chapter?
I will also mention the scene with the Cadwani soldiers preparing to attack Adrian, because that when I read it, and I already had an interest in history when I read it, and so it is a part of the chapter that really resonates, like, with people that know the history of Eastern Europe, because on one hand it's really funny, but on the other hand you can see all the historical allegories and not so pretty things about all the wars that happened here. And so, yeah, it was really interesting to read this part.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it was actually funny, because when I was first reading it, it's like, yeah, but it's like a bittersweet funny, because you have all these examples in your head, which we can get into later. But for me also, I really like the scene with Rayla and the mercenaries, because it's so fascinating how well it's written, that you, even though it's like it's a battle scene, and like also a lot of things are going on, you still get a good sense of what's going on, and the feelings especially of the people involved. And you really can, while reading it, you feel the desperation, and yeah, it's just really immersive. So I really like that one.
Yeah. I think Sapkowski would disagree. Like, when I actually got a chance to hear him speak to him at Luca a number of years ago, one of the things I admire most about the Witcher series, it does feel like a character-driven story, and moments like this or chapters like this, I think, really exemplify that. He always talks about how the characters serve the plot, but I really feel like everything in The Witcher is driven by the characters, and the situations always come back to the core element of the human experience. We see the mercenaries in the Northern Kingdoms, we see the soldiers from Nilfgaard, we get Emir himself, false Ciri, the mages, Geralt and Dandelion, and it's amazing, I think, how many perspectives we have, and how it really contextualizes all sides of the war.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. Like, even characters which get relatively like not that much screen time, or like book time, I guess.
Page time?
Page time, yeah. Still like make impact, and you remember those stories, you remember the names, and you remember what they were feeling. And this is, even though again it's maybe like a few pages even only, and you didn't know them before, and they never come up again, and you still remember these stories, and their stories, or their glimpses of their lives, or the end of their lives. It's like whatever it may happen. So yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's remarkable about this chapter, just by just how many characters. We of course have our main characters, Dandelion, Geralt, and Emir, which we follow throughout the entire saga, but we also have many characters that never return again, and then they are there only for a few pages. And Yeah, it's remarkable how Sapkowski manages that even these really tiny characters have an impact on the reader and the book.
One of the things that I really want to ask you guys about, as we are all coming from different countries and different perspectives, I've read the English translation. Cyprian, you've read the original Polish. Szczepan, you've read the Czech edition. What are some differences in the translations, or things that stood out to you, or questions that you have about what might appear in other books and other editions?
Yeah, I have an interesting tidbit in this regard because the name of dandelion in the Czech translation is marigold. And I was, it's interesting, right? Because Tris marigold, how did it happen? And it turns out that the Czech translation predates the invention of Tris marigold in the Witcher saga. And when the Czech translator came up with the name Marigold, Sapkowski wanted to make fun of him, and so he named a character Tris Marigold, so he would have to change it. So the name of Tris Marigold in the Czech translation is actually Tris ranunzul, and which is another Latin name for a plant. And so it's quite funny how sometimes Czech fans have a problem when they are juggling like 4 different names in their head of just a couple characters. And so if I will talk about marigold in this chapter on accident, I mean dandelion, but it's really the result of a beef between the Czech translator and Sapkowski.
Sapkowski is so petty. It's so funny. Like, he, again, in Luca, he was kind of going on about, like, the translator is a traitor. And that's hilarious.
The Czech one?
Yeah, probably.
That's funny. I didn't know that. And I mean, I guess most people didn't know that. So that's very interesting. It came full circle, as in the Czech translation, Tris has also a different name. Like,
yeah.
Name. So, well, the pettiness continues. Yeah, but I'm always,
I can't be mad at it. It's because it's kind of funny.
Yeah, it is. What I'm actually interested in is asking, because what I really like about, like, also the way the books are written is because Sapkowski also paints like a picture with the language the characters speak in a way, right? So even though you can sometimes, of course, paint like accents or something even in the book, he also uses a lot of old Polish words, like dialects, and just not typical words, right? So if I consider myself a native or near native Polish speaker, again, I was born and raised in Berlin, but my parents are from Poland, so I was speaking Polish my whole life. But I sometimes also I catch myself reading and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Like, I've never seen that word before. So yeah, sometimes I reach out to my father or Google it really quick, like, what does that mean? And it's like a really old Polish word. So for example, in the right at the beginning, when Dandelion is riding with his escort, they're all also like speaking with in this different kind of Polish, you could say. So I'm interested how it is in the different versions, if they the translators also like incorporate that or play around with the language.
Ooh. Let me see. I'm skimming through my book at the moment. It doesn't seem like there's a ton of like difference between the Captain Dandelion. There's a lot of difference in Peter Kenny's performance when you're listening to the audiobooks. But when I'm looking at the text itself in English, it doesn't seem like there's a ton of difference there.
What about the Czech version?
Yeah, in the Czech translation, the translator really went all out, and so the characters speak very distinctly. Most distinctly speak the dwarves, because the Czech translator decided that they are, of course, miners and they live in the mountains. So in Czechia, we have several mountainous regions that have their own dialects. And so they, for example, speak Moravian dialect. And so from that, it became a trope in Czech fantasy and D&D that the dwarves speak with this specific dialect.
That's interesting. See?
For example, how dwarves often have Scottish accents in English fantasy. The same way the dwarves have this dialect in Czech fantasy because of the influence of the Sapkowski's translator.
That's interesting that, like, specifically The Witcher had such a big impact on Czech fantasy, like, within the region. Huh.
Yeah, it had, and actually, The Witcher is sometimes even in a school, like when you have exams and you can pick literature, sometimes he is there, that you can pick The Witcher and have an exam from it.
That's interesting. I mean, that's quite interesting to hear. I unfortunately cannot really comment on the Polish schooling system if it's in there, because I never went to school in Poland. It's not in Germany, I can assure you that, but I would be surprised if it was. I'm glad to hear like this has such a big impact on Czechia, but also I'm not that surprised again. The language is fairly similar. I think Czech is one of the, if not the closest language to Polish. And of course, geographically and culturally, we're also quite similar. So in many aspects, so that's very interesting.
To continue the conversation from translation, I'd love to ask you both. You're both historians. First, just some context for listeners. What kind of history do you both specialize in?
I studied just history in general. I didn't have a specialization, but my bachelor's thesis dealt with the history in pop culture and the role that history plays in popular media. And so my bachelor thesis actually dealt with the comparison between the game Kingdom Come Deliverance and a Czech movie, Medieval, which came out last year.
Yeah, that's also interesting to hear, especially since we're talking about also like influence of history in pop culture kind of in this book as well. So that's going to be fun. Yeah, my main area is like more modern history. So after the Middle Ages, like even 18, 19, 20-ish century. And so it's a bit later than I guess most I mean, what most fantasy is kind of loosely based on, like the Middle Ages in Europe and stuff. But I still find that topic, of course, fascinating. But yeah, also there's, which we'll get into soon, there's a lot of reference to like later wars, like World War II, for example. So
Of course.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, in this chapter, there is just so much, as I said, that happens. And we spend a lot of time hearing about the military movements that are happening on the continent, the way that Nilfgaard is just moving, just destroying everything northward through Lyria, Adern, moving up to even Cadwyn, and building treaties there. Meve is missing. Foltest and Henselt have decided to be neutral or to just make agreements and split other kingdoms. Sorcerers have fled. As we hear more about what's happening on the continent, I think, Štěpán, you had pulled out a number of historical references.
Yeah. I don't know if Cyprian also wants to talk about them, because I had in mind, for example, of course, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact that divided Poland, but also the fallout of the Munich Treaty. The territory of Czechoslovakia was divided between the neighboring countries, and I know it takes place in a medieval-inspired setting, but really there are many allegories to the 20th century and like the most recent history.
Yeah, we can. I mean, we can most definitely talk about them. I saw all your notes, and I think they're excellent points. So again, like when it comes to like picking a country apart and neutral countries, kind of even through their neutrality, like and in their chase for self-preservation through neutrality, if you want to put it that way, like also continue to speed up the demise of the other country. In real life, that would be Czechoslovakia. Is quite interesting. Interesting, and I'm not quite sure who said it, but there's a famous quote I think most of us have heard, which was it goes something like, those who do nothing in the face of evil, also help evil, something like that. I'm paraphrasing here, but
yeah.
I think that is an example which we see happening in the Witcher world. We can see happening countless times in the real world. And yeah, I think the Munich Agreement and the continuous disassemblement, if you want, of Czechoslovakia in that sense is a really good example here, and was just, I mean, taken as a huge inspiration.
For listeners who might not know much about the Munich Agreement, would one of you be able to describe briefly what it was?
I'll let the Czech one take.
Okay, so before the World War II, Hitler did, of course, came to power, and Nazis were militarizing, and the Western world was afraid that there will be a world war again, and they wanted to do everything to prevent it. And so after the Nazi Germany annexed Austria, they turned to Czechoslovakia, which had a very large German minority in a region called the Sudetenland. It included the borders of the Czechoslovak state, and the Nazis knew that the Czechoslovak government had built many defenses there. The Czechs were prepared to fight them. And so they inspired local movements that were fighting for German independence from the Czechoslovakia and joining of the Nazi Germany. And so in the end, the Western powers, together with Mussolini's Italy and Germany, decided that Czechoslovakia will give them this borderland, without which it was basically defenseless. And they didn't even invite the Czech delegates to the meeting. It was taken that the Czech will accept this treaty, and so it is one of the greatest traumas of Czechs in the 20th century, because the consensus is that we were prepared to defend ourselves, and the Western powers didn't let us. They said that they won't support it. And of course, a couple months later, Hitler invaded Poland, so it was all for nothing. And Hitler actually gained a lot of tanks and arms industry from the Czech lands. And the reason why I included it in the notes is because Czechoslovakia had a bad relationship with all of their countries, including Poland. And there's a region in the Czech Republic called Zaolzie, and it historically had, and also today, it has a large Polish minority. And so the Poles annexed it. They actually participated in this partition. So when I read this chapter for the first time, it was interesting how, on one hand, I really had in mind the reference to the to the known partitions of Poland, but also to these partitions with the Polish army participated in.
Yeah, that was a quick rundown of that, which is interesting, especially Poland's role, because it was, in that sense, a little bit different, because Poland wasn't actually in the agreement because they also weren't invited. But because of the fact that they weren't invited, even though Poland tried to be also a major power in Europe at that time, they just decided to do that anyway. They were like, since Czechoslovakia is like, everyone's getting a piece, so we might as well do too. And especially since it has like a Polish minority. So there was a lot of stuff happening. But I also like the comparison to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, because you wrote down a good quote here. They shook hands on the bridge of a river, Divne, Margrave Mansfeld of Ard, Carrick, and Menno Cohern, the commanders of chief. They shook hands over the bleeding, dying kingdom of Edirne. selling a criminal division of the spoils, if we want to go down to the source material again, which is basically, I mean, you have famous photos, you can all just put it in the Google real quick, how the Soviets and the Germans actually met at the border. They predestined in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact when they invaded Poland from both sides. So you actually have like, and they also met at the river, if I remember correctly. So you have literally the same image happening in the book being described as it was in real life. And Poland was, of course, defeated after the war of onto France. So yeah, this is again how Sapkowski incorporates like kind of real life events happening, especially in Europe, into like his world.
Yeah, and these references don't stop. There are so many that you've listed here, Štěpán, which is, again, so fascinating to hear about. You also had a historical note about Nilfgaard attacking Lear and Ader and without declaring war because of Demavend's attack, false flag attack in Dolangra during the Mages Conclave on Fanad. What was the historical reference that you were able to glean there?
Yeah, that is a reference, and I mean it's a direct reference because the name of the settlement that they mention is very similar to the real one, but it is a reference to the Gliwice incident when the Nazis organized a false flag attack on Poland, and that was the beginning of the Second World War.
Yeah, the Gliwice incident, for again those people who don't know, is like kind of seen as a starting point of the war in Europe, kind of, because Gliwice is a town which is today in Poland actually, but back then wasn't. It was actually part of the German Reich. And what happened was basically before the war started, before the invasion, and Germany, of course, was already prepared to invade. They were amassing troops at the border, which was also mentioned in the book, in Sapkowski's book, in this chapter, which he was talking about, like why it was quite clear that it was a false flag attack. Was also, he mentions in the chapter that after the incident, Nilfgaard moved in really quickly and took like a bunch of border forts in like a few days, because they had already amassed all these troops. And the same thing happened in the beginning of World War II. Like Germany already built up all its forces along the borders. And yeah, the Gliwice incident, there was like a bunch of German soldiers dressed up as Polish soldiers, attacking most famously the radio station in Gleiwitz in German back then. And yeah, also shouted like Polish things through the radio actually for everyone to hear. So it would appear as if the Poles attacked like Gliwice, or like the radio station took over. And of course took that as a casus belli and as an excuse to invade Poland, same way Nilfgaard did in the book. So, and of course, as Štěpán mentioned, this is has quite a lot of references to this specific incidents, but these are things that happened quite a lot through history, and maybe for like also the audience in North America and Asia, actually, one other and maybe even more famous incident of that is the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, which kind of led to the start of the Vietnam War, right? Which was the US staged like an attack on their own warship, which turned out to be a false flag. So, and took then this excuse to formally move into Vietnam. So yeah, that's a quite old trick in the art of war, to pretend you are being attacked, and so it doesn't look like a war of aggression, but well, it is what it is, as they say.
Thank you for bringing in like similar scenarios or from other points of history and other regions as well. As you said, it's probably a pretty universal trick of the trade.
Yeah, unfortunately so.
Yeah. Anything else that stood out to you? Any other historical references that particularly stood out to you in this chapter?
I would, it isn't a historical reference, but I just to hammer home the fact how in the 20th century how the countries were unstable. There is an old Czech joke that goes somewhat like this. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, and it probably won't be funny, but an old man dies and goes to heaven, and there is Saint Peter by the gate, and he asks him, "Where were you born?" And he says, "Austria-Hungary." Okay, where did you marry? Czechoslovakia. Where did you had kids? In the Soviet Union. And where did you die? In Ukraine. And St. Peter is like, man, that's a lot. You traveled. And he's like, nonsense. I never left Mukachevo.
That's I knew already where this was going. It was quite a turbulent time for, I think, everyone involved, actually, like the post
Yeah.
the post World War One period in Eastern Europe. It was like, again, a lot of new countries forming out of these empires who were just falling apart, and a lot of wars, unfortunately. And this is kind of the time in the book, in this chapter, actually, which I think shows the time right before. Like, this is kind of the new world war, which is starting in the Witcher world, and all this confusion that comes with war. And not to mention, again, the chaos doesn't start when the last bullet is fired, because when countries fall apart, when new borders are being drawn, this brings a lot of confusion into the mix. And it happened everywhere, and also of course in our beloved Witcher world.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're getting to dig into a lot of the historical references that appear just throughout this chapter. This is, of course, a uniquely heavy chapter for, as we said, the instigation of the war and everything that's happening on the continent. And as we look at the writing of the chapter itself, it's interesting because aside from the vignettes, we're actually with Dandelion, and we're not often with him as like a primary point of view character. How do you guys think the authorial voice changes with Dandelion as opposed to some of the other characters while we're with him, in Brokilon and throughout the chapter?
Well, I really enjoyed this side of Dandelion, if you want to say that. I mean, even again in the beginning, when he isn't even in Brokilon, when he's going to Brokilon, and I think one of the first scenes in this chapter is him talking with the commander of his escort, and that they are like scared to go further because of it's dangerous. And he's like, with the conversation going on and on, he like appears braver and braver, even in front of these hardened soldiers. And it's actually a funny remark at the end when he's like riding off, is that he's speeding up as he's going because he doesn't want to ruin the reputation just built himself with a group of soldiers, which I found really funny because it's actually kind of out of character for Dandelion. It's not what we normally see, but he's very driven to help his friend Geralt, of course. So again, it's like it's very interesting to see that the side of him. And I really enjoyed also the aspect how he gets then into Brokilon, because a lot of times in the Witcher universe, we see like things being maybe not actually solved, but like a lot of things are being resolved through conflict, like oftentimes also just raw physical conflict. And here, rather than I don't know, go in with like riding in on the horse and just clawing his way through it, it doesn't make any sense. The normal army and even these hardened soldiers which he was coming from were afraid to go there because they knew they couldn't like do anything through that way. And he goes in singing, like exposing himself, and just going in like with a different approach to this scary world of Brokilon, and not being actually so sure himself if he's gonna make it. He's like, well, this is my best shot. Let's have it, and it works, of course, somehow, luckily, as ever so often with Dandelion. So yeah, we get a lot of things here with Dandelion, which yeah, again, I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I completely agree with Cyprian, and I will say that at the beginning of this chapter, it's quite interesting how Dandelion, even though he's clearly scared, and also these soldiers are very scared, he still goes there and he is determined to find Geralt. And that is one of the aspects of Dandelion that I think sometimes maybe doesn't come across all adaptations, that he is, of course, a troubadour, a womanizer, but he is also a friend of Geralt, a very close friend, and he is willing to risk everything for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find this chapter so interesting to read because I feel like, again, this could be Peter Kenny's rendition on the audiobooks, but I feel like even the neutral narrator gets more poetic as they're describing the way that Brokilon kind of looks like so foreboding, or the way that the ribbon looks. Even the way that Pegasus shits in the middle of the river feels oddly poetic because it's surrounded by his point of view, even with a neutral narrator. So I find that really interesting and very delightful, how much more poetic the writing as a whole feels in this chapter alone.
That's actually such an interesting point, because I didn't actually know. I mean, no, I did notice it, because this is like, that's what I'm saying. Like, also the way it's written, and like this whole, actually kind of like, not much is happening in a sense, right? He's just riding down to this river, and then he's crossing it, and yeah, okay, he's singing, and then he gets to Brooklyn, okay, and then things are happening. But even this short little sequence, like, it's so vividly like explained and described what is happening. And I didn't actually, like, maybe I didn't connect the dots, but I think you might be onto something here.
It's just nice to read, but like I said, even hearing about his horse shitting in the river, there's entertainment in that. The whole thing feels very comical, even with the gravity of suspense and with his fear.
Right.
Because like he can't predict how the Dryads will respond to him, even though he looks nothing like a soldier. He's on his own. He's singing. It's interesting to see how he tries to soothe his fears, because it's just talking out loud.
Yeah.
And then you have like the narrator on top of those two other layers. And that makes it all the more enjoyable to read.
Yeah.
This is not a perspective that we tend to get on the continent, like a slightly romanticized version of something as simple as going down a hill and crossing a river. Whenever we're with Geralt, particularly, and hearing about Dandelion, he seems very aloof, I would say, or like kind of impartial to Dandelion, and we hear about him as an external character. But when we're with Dandelion, everything feels so much more dramatic, as is the nature of the character.
Yeah, and through that, actually, like, again, with this like kind of lightheartedness, poetic kind of vibe, you still don't lose the gravity of the situation. And that is something I really admire, and I think adds a lot to the writing and the scene, because even though, again, it's Dandelion, and he's talking to himself and stuff, but you still, like, you don't sense, you don't lose this feeling, suspense. Like, he's talking to himself, and it's kind of funny, but you know why he's talking to himself. It's because he's scared, right? He doesn't know what's gonna happen, and you never lose this suspense. So yeah, it's interesting. It's good.
Yeah, there is a note that I had on the song in Elder Speech that he sings, because this song was actually featured on the soundtrack of The Witcher 1, but also The Witcher 2, which has a very beautiful choir version of it. And I thought it quite interesting how sometimes Sapkowski just writes a song for one scene, and then it several years later spirals into like an actual song with like an actual choir that like people sing, and I think that's beautiful that it just came like full circle.
Yeah. And that is one of the beautiful things on the audiobooks. As I mentioned, when Peter Kenny narrates, he actually sings anytime there's music, whether it's Dandelion or it's like a war march or something. He always makes a tune and a song to it. And we actually spoke about it when I had casual. When I had Doug Cockle and Peter Kenny on the podcast, that was a big question that a lot of people had for Peter, was how he thinks about and writes the music, even for these little ditties that appear throughout the books. And I think it's from his experience in choirs and choruses and history with, little medieval tunes here and there as well. But if you're interested in listening to that episode, it's episode 75, so you can pop back a couple of episodes and listen. But yeah, it made that part delightful as a listener to hear the music that he added to that song. But I'll have to go back and listen to, I haven't played The Witcher 1 or 2 myself, so I'll have to go back and check those out on the soundtrack.
Yeah, they are both quite beautiful.
Yeah, I'm sure that there holds a very special place for a lot of people too, except for maybe Gary.
Yeah, that's probably true.
One of the points that you had brought up, Cyprian, was the kind of effect of neutrality, right? Neutrality is still a choice, as we learn throughout The Witcher, and as Geralt really learns and examines in this chapter. We've spent how many books and how many stories with a character that claims he abides by neutrality as one of his core principles. He never wants to get involved, and he'll, supposedly choose the side with coin every time. We know that's not exactly true. Me and Cyprian spoke about the lesser evil a number of years ago, and we saw how his neutrality already had a poor effect. In this chapter specifically, after hearing about the fall of Lyria and Aedern, and then Temeria and Cadwyn's neutrality, Geralt says, "There may no longer be faith nor truth in the world, but surely good sense still exists. What say you, Dandelion? Is there still good sense in the world, or do contemptibility and contempt remain? You say nothing, which means Ciri was right, that Codringer was right. You were all right. Only I, the naive, anachronistic, and stupid Witcher, was wrong." Geralt has held on to his beliefs of neutrality since the beginning of his character. What do you guys think he's realized in this conversation as he's hearing about the war, and why and how do you think his perspective has changed?
This is quite a heavy question, but I will try my best. I think that he's realized that sometimes when people try to stay neutral, they don't want to take a side and have blame on themselves of the situation. But when he, for example, hears about Temeria being neutral in the war, that is already the act of Foltest declaring neutrality. That is taking a side, and it means that a person cannot be completely uninvolved in these matters, but even though he will consciously try to stay away from them, it still tells something. It is a statement.
I mean, I kind of share that view, and I think that is also one of the core points being highlighted here, is that no response is also in response, right? So some parties, in this case, countries, they just want to stay out of it. They automatically help the stronger invader, right? Everyone has a reason for why they're doing it, and it's quite obvious. They're doing it for self-preservation, of course. But then again, how long will this last, right? Because as we can see, for example, going back to the Munich Agreement before the Second World War, there were a lot of countries, and this is actually also quite interesting because I've written a whole paper on that topic, the preparation right before September 39, is that there was a lot of course, diplomacy going on before, during, and also after the Munich conference in Eastern Europe. And there was a lot of old qualms which hindered the forming of a big, strong anti-Hitler alliance, if you would say so. And through this neutrality, countries just deciding, okay, I don't want to get involved into that. All right, Czechoslovakia is about to get screwed here, but it's not us. So whatever. We're not in a position to help. yeah, that might have been a decent solution temporarily, but in the long run, a lot of these countries also got screwed over, right? And I'm not even talking about Poland here, which obviously got invaded and stuff. We all know that, but also a lot of minor powers in the Balkans and in the Eastern Europe region. So that's something you have to consider, like also the long-term versions. Like, yeah, maybe we're not in a position to resist right now, but are we gonna be in a better position later if more and more of our allies fall away? Which is also a point you can reference in the Witcher books, not even necessarily in this chapter, but like throughout, because one of the events that is quite often like cited is the Battle of Sodden, of course, the big northern victory over Nilfgaard, where all the big kingdoms fought along, they fought together and they won. And now it's not looking like that, right? Everyone's kind of looking out for himself, and we can see the effects of it starting right now. It's the another classic from the Art of War. It's divide and conquer, of course, and this is what is perfect. This is the game Nilfgaard is playing, and they're pretty damn good at it. So they're not getting tricked into another Sodden, and they're just playing their cards very well. And this is the issue. Like if you all stand alone, you will not have a chance. You will just get picked apart.
Right.
But yeah, so again, coming back, like that was a big loop. But I think, as Stefan said, it's a very interesting point, a good question, and like a part which gives you something to think about. It's definitely food for thought in the Witcher universe, and maybe in history or your personal life.
Of course. I find it interesting from a character sense because, as I said, Geralt has explored the subject of neutrality time and time again. We see this in The Lesser Evil. We kind of see this in A Question of Price when he doesn't want to get involved and then all of a sudden he's defending Dooney. Sharawed in Blood of Elves. Ciri has all of these questions about why neutrality, why the kings, why the Scoia'tael. And then Geralt eventually gets involved because his immediate loved ones are in danger. He has continual conversations in Time of Contempt with Codringer, with Dijkstra, with Philippa, with Vilgefortz. And it gets to this point where he's just like, why does my neutrality offend everybody so? And because they see the picture that, as you said, Cyprian, choosing neutrality is still choosing a side, and oftentimes it ends up being the side of the aggressor. And so there is a certain level of guilt and reservation there. Of course, when it's you and your ideals and your values, it's something that Geralt wants to stick to and something that he feels compelled to defend. But as soon as he's hearing about what neutrality looks like on the outside, he's hearing about Temeria and Temerian Foltest letting Nilfgaard have run through all of these different countries, letting Francesca take Dolblathana, for example. Same thing with Henselt of Cadwyn, who was meant to have all sorts of agreements, and suddenly shaking hands over the dying ashes of Aedern. Once he hears this, that's when he kind of snaps and is just like, no, this is the cost of neutrality. And there is a high cost. He just heard that the entire city of Vengerberg was slaughtered because they defended themselves to the last man. And that's a place that he has had. He has memories there. Obviously, Yennefer is there. He lived there, I think, for about 6 months, we hear in A Shard of Ice. It's probably easier to be critical of that perspective when it's not yourself. And I wonder to what extent that outside point of view was necessary for him to kind of change course and to, set aside his neutrality when he's seeing the effect that it's not just him that is experiencing this, but what happens when you're looking at it on a larger scale. But yeah, what a sharp contrast for his character. Obviously, Geralt's an established character, so we rarely see, throughout the course of the saga, particularly as the main character shifts, but there's not a lot of moments in which his character is really changed so fundamentally. And I think this chapter and this moment is a big deal for him, and for us as readers.
Yeah.
Yes, I wouldn't have put it better. He now can clearly see that even when he chooses neutrality. His friends still are in danger. Ciri is in danger, and he can stay in Beauclair, but they will face the consequences of the war and everything. And so he, of course, cares deeply about them, and that is, I think, one of the things that forces him to act. That he now sees that his neutrality isn't maybe the greatest stand to take.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. And I think, Alyssa, I'm sure you remember when that the short story of Blaviken and Renfrey and the Ultimatum is hands down one of my favorites. Oh no, it's actually my favorite one. Like, let's be honest, because this is in that short story the key point, right? Neutrality and or the cost of decision, because every decision comes with a cost. And this is interesting because we always we talk about all these big decisions by these big kings and countries in that context of the Witcher or in history. But I think that is a point that is also extraordinarily important for most people in their private life as well, because I think we all had throughout our lives, and probably will have also, many decisions to take which aren't easy, right? There's sometimes you're faced with a question, with a choice to make, where there is no good choice, right? And I'm not talking about, of course, situations like that, life and death, like in the Witcher universe, hopefully for most people, but still, like the outcome, neither outcome is ideal, and it always somebody will lose. And in these type of situations, oftentimes we feel like it's just easier to just block it away, like, I don't want to deal with that right now, and or no, I cannot take a decision here, it's like I cannot do either one, and stuff like that. And then you maybe procrastinate, or you end up not choosing anything else, and this often ends up being the worst decision, like not taking action, like not choosing something, right? So I think we can learn a lot from that. And seeing again, I always used to hear when I was earlier that a decision is always better than no decision, right? It's better to take the leap and take a decision than not take one at all. And I think this is something that Geralt is also trying to realize right now. So yeah, it's an interesting point in the sense of the greater political situation, of course, of the world, but also a personal one for Geralt, and maybe for many people as well.
And this is a topic that continually comes up in The Witcher, and in the books. Even just a couple of chapters previously, in chapter 2, Margarita Antille says the same thing to Ciri, albeit in slightly different words. This is the quote where she says, "An enchantress always takes action, wrongly or rightly, that is revealed later, but you should act, be brave, seize life by the scruff of the neck. Believe me, you should only regret actions or decisions, even if they occasionally end in sadness or regret."
Yes.
So we're seeing, it's such a good quote, but we're seeing like Ciri is learning this from experienced sorceresses. She's getting taught, and she acts on this as well in her own way. But Geralt is learning the same, and they're learning this at the exact same time, albeit in slightly different ways.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up that quote, because this is actually also one of my favorite quotes from the whole series, and I remember it so vividly because I think now I'm sure you had that on GoodMorhen as well.
I
And
did.
I remember
have
to
it on
this day. It's
GoodMorhen.
like the white background with the falcon. I think it's really beautifully done. So if you haven't checked out GoodMorhen on Instagram, I know you're not active on there anymore.
It just had its 5th anniversary a few days ago.
I know, I saw it. But well, I know you focus on other things, but I always like to go there still from time to time and look at them. Yeah, check it out. But yeah, it's such a great quote, and I think it's for a lot of people, again, like you can learn so much from that.
While we were talking about the quote, I also remembered one other thing about the chapter with Ciri and Margarita and Yennefer, and that is the words that Yennefer says about Rayla, that Yennefer finds out that Rayla is a mercenary, and she says that as a mercenary, she will never be as good as a like a regular soldier, because she fights for coin and not, for example, for her country. But in this very chapter, we see that Rayla makes the ultimate sacrifice with her men and sacrifices herself to ensure the safety of the fleeing civilians. And I remember that when I read it, and I remembered that quote by Yennefer, I was really taken aback by it, how Sapkowski really lays the groundwork in earlier chapters to make points in not even like in the same book, but in like a couple books later.
Yeah, that contrast is certainly interesting, but I think it's, again, like one of the things that humanizes the war. And also you see it's something else that she said about Fabio Sachs. Like, it's the same thing with Rayla. Like, yes, she acknowledges that, like, this is what we're paid for. We're the rear guard now. And we have an obligation to defend these villagers and refugees. But yeah, obviously Yennefer is very skeptical, and as you said, Sapkowski does a really great job of laying down the groundwork for us to be skeptical of her as readers. We're not expecting to encounter her ever again. Why would we? And then we see the nature of her character here when she's actually confronted with death, to not mince words. Even that point itself does a really nice job of kind of tying up some of the great elements of this book and of the chapter. He successfully leverages a lot of these different perspectives to tell an even more complete story of war and of sacrifice. And I think that that's, it's what makes a lot of this chapter and the book compelling. I had said previously Time of Contempt is not my favorite book because I really like a lot of the other books. It's not that it's a bad book. I just happen to like some of the other ones more. But we are now in part 5 of my therapy session with Time of Contempt. And I'm talking so positively about the book, and I'm realizing how excited I am.
Yeah, I would also like to add that since we started talking about the chapter, we talked a lot about war and genocides and mass murder and slavery and things like that. But it's interesting how this chapter is still very funny. And I think that is one of the things that makes The Witcher special, that it has this Eastern European perspective that I think many people from the Eastern European nations or Central European nations will agree with, that even though horrible things are happening, very horrible things, you can still like find joy in life, and that life isn't like out to get you. Horrible things can happen, but they will happen and life will move on. For example, if we use like historical examples, there was of course World War II, there was conflict between Czechoslovakia and Poland, between Czechoslovakia and Hungary, Germany, but today, these nations are all part of the European Union and are friends. And yeah, that is one of, I think, the defining perspective of The Witcher, that time will pass and that even horrible things will be replaced by great things.
Yeah. I'm just going to call back something that Softy said when we discussed Chapter 1. We had a small tangent about the Battle of Brenna. Something that he mentioned was like, it's one of the biggest battles in the Witcher series, and it's defined by love. And I have a feeling that the same could be said a lot about this chapter. As you said, Szczepan, this chapter covers the instigation of war, genocide, every crime under the sun. However, it is also a very strong examination of love and loyalty, whether that is to friends, to individuals, between Dandelion and Geralt, for example. When we look at Rayla and her love of country and loyalty and her responsibility and obligation to defend these people, again, maybe it is just coin, but she could have run away. They all could have. So there is a sense there of having, as I said, love and loyalty. And I think that you have both of those sides, and you can see that dichotomy. You can't have war without that. Like, you have to have one and the other. And I think that this chapter does a really fantastic job of examining both.
Yeah, I really like the point, because I think what it ultimately comes down to is, yes, during times of war, you have all these horrible things happen in pretty much every war. But you also you have like these war is, of course, the most extreme situation there can be. And when the stakes are this high, you get also extreme responses. So in war, you get the most horrific, of course, stories of stuff happening, but you also get these stories of these incredible displays of humanity and sacrifice and love, as you mentioned. I mean, this is quite interesting, because again, when the stakes are this high, this tends to bring out the extremes in people on both spectrums, of course. Unfortunately, maybe as well, but it's just the nature of the situation people find themselves in back then, today, unfortunately, and also in fictional universes.
Yeah, I do think this is actually a really nice point to end the podcast episode on. But before we do that, do you guys happen to have any final thoughts on Chapter 5 of Time of Contempt?
I think it's quite interesting how Sapkowski will have all these different characters, and he just like has them in the book. He doesn't like make some big proclamation, for example, the fact that Rayla is a female soldier, but he will like show their actions and let them speak for themselves.
I always I always think about that when I see like stuff like that, like a strong female commanders in military history. There's a very interesting figure in Polish history, which is Emilia Plater. Maybe Stefan has heard of it. She was a rebel leader, a Polish one, in one of the Polish uprisings. And she was a female, and she led men into battle. She was very influential. So yeah, that is something interesting to look up. Strong women in history. So yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, I love that Sapkowski litters women, influential women, but also different shades of womanhood. We talked about that when we discussed Chapter 2, but they're so different. And I love that he's made them prolific throughout the Witcher series, whether they're queens or sorceresses or even like mercenaries, and so on and so forth. And I love that we get to experience that. And as I said, I'm sure that a lot of that was influenced by the fact that he had a lot of prominent female figures in post-World War II Poland as well. And yeah, really love that additional context and the additional reference. Yeah, I definitely agree. Like we've spoken about, this chapter has so many points of view and so many characters that come into play. Just to expand the world and humanize the nature of what the continent is experiencing at this really critical time. Yeah, and that I think that makes it so much more interesting and so much more entertaining as a reader, and provides a really excellent experience as you're going through the book for the first time and beyond. Cyprian, any last thoughts on the chapter?
Well, again, as I said, I really enjoyed that chapter, because we get so many layers of character development, also like different sides of different characters, a lot of new characters we never seen before, we'll never see after, a lot of stories, and as we said, the best and worst of humanity, I guess, in the most extreme of situations. So it's a lot, it's long, but it's very, very nicely written. It's so, again, I just think it's also a very important chapter for the pacing of the book, and it's all around a very enjoyable read. So yeah, I've just been happy to be able to share my thoughts and discuss it with you guys. So thanks for having us.
I actually have another final point that
Let's hear it, Stefan.
Yeah. The final point that I thought up now is actually, I remembered when I first read it, and we of course talked a lot about the part where Cadwyn divides Adrian with Nilfgaard, and there is a specific pair of words that is used there, and that is brotherly help. I cannot explain to you how, as a person with the knowledge of history, I cringed at those words because we hear it so many times in history books, and it is such a common statement by aggressors here, that in this area, that they didn't came to conquer and kill those people, they came with a brotherly help. And so my mind just lit up with all these different allegories and ideas, and I think that that is quite remarkable how only two words can have such a strong reaction. And of course, I was so happy to discuss this chapter with you, and it was simply a pleasure. I just hope that some people that are knowledgeable in history that will listen to this chapter won't take offense at some of my takes, because I was so nervous that I will say something not really controversial but wrong, and people will be like, that is not really how I would describe the Munich Agreement, Štěpán, sorry.
Well, yeah, I'm going to edit it anyway. You've done a fantastic job. I've been so happy to have you both on. And like I said, I'm learning so much from you both. And it has been so lovely to, one, introduce you guys, because like I said, I think you guys would be fantastic and get on super well. But to really learn from both of you a little bit more about your expertise and a little bit more about history, and to color the context of the world that we love so much. And I'm just so grateful to have had you both here today for this chapter. So that is it for our show today. Cyprian, Štěpán, thank you so much for joining us for this episode, and thank you to our Hanza for listening. You can find both Cyprian and Štěpán in the Hanza Discord if you'd like to discuss the episode further, or absolutely anything else. If you have a hot take on The Witcher 1, let them know. I'm sure they'd be happy to go spar with you in the chat rooms. But that's it for today. Next episode, join us as we continue our discussion of Andrzej Sapkowski's Time of Contempt with Chapter 6. Yay. Okay.
It's
done. Woo!
My first ever podcast.
Oh, there you go.
You did so good.
Thank you. I was so nervous.
Oh, there's nothing to be nervous about. You did fantastic. You did super well. Thanks for joining us at the breakfast table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and a complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastandbeauclair.com. Breakfast and Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen. It's hosted by Alyssa with the tidings from Toussaint News, segment by Laux Winterflix. The show is edited by Alyssa with music by Alex Berner. Breakfast and Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B, Hammond of the Edge of the World, Chart from Megara Glamorai, the original Roach, Cotringer's Cat, Libby, John of Riblia, Tom from Australia, Jill Kate the Tabby Witch, James Carson III, Miriam of Temeria, and Softy. Special thanks to Cyprian and Štěpán for joining us for this episode, and our international Hanza for their support.